Lena. Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of the AAAC seminar series talks. And today is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Hatice, who is full professor of affective intelligence and robotics at the Department of Computer Science and Technology at University of Cambridge in the UK. And I think she is very well known to everyone because for many reasons for her research, but she's also been very active in the AAAC community. So she has been president of the association in the past, and general co-chair of the AAAC 2019, among many other things. So I'm going to read a little bit of the bio that we put on the website. Okay, so she is director of the Affective Intelligence and Robotics AFAR lab, and associate director of the Central for Human Inspired AI in Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge. Her research is advances really multimodal social and affective intelligence for AI systems, and especially for embodied agents and robots. And she brings together and cross-fertilized research in machine learning, affective computing, social signal processing, and human nonverbal behavior understanding. And she's at the moment strongly focused on well-being ethics and the fairness and explainability of AI, which she's going to talk about today. She has many publications, over 200 papers, and she's a really well, highly ranked scientist with many awards, and well, she's very active organizing things. I keep seeing her name pass everywhere. So I'll let you finish reading the bio, and let's then give the floor to Hatice. You can start when you wish. Just as a reminder, I will stop the recording at the end. People can ask questions on the chat or at the end, or if Hatice doesn't mind, but maybe better not to interrupt. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lola, for having me and for inviting me as well to give this talk. So my talk is titled Fairness for Effective and Health AI. And indeed, my group focuses on different aspects, but today will be the main focus of this talk. So when we start talking about fairness, the first thing that of course comes up is artificial intelligence ethics, also known as AI ethics. So these days, this is actually listed in different organizations in different ways. And here I'm just providing sort of a brief screenshot from the way it's listed in the UK government's website as a set of actionable principles. Not necessarily in this particular order, but I put fairness on top because that will be the focus today. But of course, there are other aspects related to transparency, explainability, privacy, and so on. But when we talk about fairness, if we are designing this and creating these and deploying these AI systems, the idea is that we should design the AI systems not to discriminate against individuals, communities, or groups. So that's the main understanding. And fairness in terms of coming to the forefront of discussions took a while, particularly in the effective computing community. It didn't really take place that long. If you look back, also our work on this started back in 2019. And there was not really much discussion happening around that time in effective computing community. But also in general in the AI community, the discussions around this started in 2017-18. And here I have put a paper, it's one of the seminal works back in 2018 by Jaber and her colleague, on gender classification. And here what we are seeing in this figure is how gender classification error rate increases as the skin color becomes darker and darker, to the point that it might actually not be able to recognize black female as female, so almost like 50% error rate. And here we are seeing also that some of these gender classification tools were by main companies like IBM and Microsoft. Of course, when this was first presented, it did attract a lot of attention, and for good and for various reasons. Also to start discussing this, but taking action and to mitigate some of these problems. And as AI started becoming more and more being used and becoming more center stage these days, of course, the discussions and even the actions toward mitigation have increased. But this is not the only example. For example, in another application that is probably more relevant for effective computing field, because we see sometimes how we could create tools to help us with interview preparations, because AI is also being used for screening in job applications. And this also was an example from the past where just modifying the brightness or even putting on glasses might change how the model is doing predictions, so the model's predictive accuracy. And so these are for vision-based AI models because it's easier to visualize as well. But of course, it doesn't apply only to vision-based AI models. We need to consider these aspects across various modalities. So with this introduction, my talk today will focus on, first of all, definitions and types of bias and fairness. We'll talk about metrics, and then specifically in terms of bias analysis and mitigation, I'll focus on two relevant subtopics. So this will be facial expression and facial action unit recognition, more relevant for facial affective signal processing. And then I also will focus on well-being assessment, specifically mental well-being and then mental health disorder prediction, which also is relevant for effective computing community. And I'll try to talk about challenges and recommendations, and we'll finish with some insightful questions. So let's start with some definitions and types. So there are different definitions of bias. That's why it's good to sort of put all of us on the same page by, saying what is my working definition today? So with bias, we are referring to factors that lead to unintended consequences. And the focus really is the type of bias that adversely affects subgroups of people. And subgroups, of course, it may vary as well, but we refer to specifically, for instance, gender, age, ethnicity. And when we talk as a bias, for instance, the example of race, if we take this as an example or as a sensitive attribute as well, so unequal representation in the data set would be considered as bias. Differences in performance accuracy would be considered bias, or even higher prediction probability of a prediction of an outcome. They're all often similarly described as racial bias. So just to bear that in mind. So today, specifically, I'll be looking at data set bias and algorithmic bias. And when I say data set bias, I'll be talking about sampling bias and data management bias. So sampling bias can typically be understood or identified by comparing how the data distribution is. So the statistical characteristics of the data set and the population it represents. So this is how we would refer to it. And data management bias, I'll give better examples down the line, but it refers to if there's any biases caused by pre-processing stage of the data. And algorithmic bias refers to the models, the machine learning or AI models that we are using, how bias might creep into them. For example, it is known that when we do deep learning, for instance, if we do early stopping or quantization, these models are prone to bias. So this is what we refer to as algorithmic bias. Similarly with bias, there is also no universal definition of fairness. So today I'll be referring to our paper from 2021. It is titled The Hitchhiker's Guide to Bias and Fairness in Facial Affective Signal Processing, where we covered overview and techniques and all of these definitions. So I'll be referring to that a lot, and I will not be providing every single definition, of course. Here I'm just showing how there are different definitions. And let's look at the two that I'll be using today with the examples. So fairness through awareness means any two individuals who are similar to a similarity metric defined for a particular task, they should receive a similar outcome. And then fairness through unawareness means an algorithm is fair as long as any sensitive attributes are not explicitly used in the decision-making process. And here, as I mentioned, the main attributes today that I will be talking about are gender, age, and ethnicity. So these are the sensitive attributes. And when it comes to fairness metrics, also there are many metrics. Again, I will not be giving all these definitions. I'm putting them here in case there are also some PhD students that would like to look back or are working in this area and can refer to this paper. One of the main ones I'll be using today is equal opportunity. So here, the protected group and unprotected group should have equal true positive rates. So this is how we are referring to it. But also we are saying that ideally we should not rely on a single fairness metric. We should adopt multiple metrics to get a more holistic picture of what is going on in our models and systems. So when we started talking about this guide and creating Hitchhiker's Guide, here I would like to walk you through the overall process of bias mitigation. So we have, I'm just trying to see if I can show I haven't used Zoom for a little bit, sorry. I was trying to see how I can put my pointer. No. Okay. So usually we have the data set, and the first step we should do is to check actually in terms of subgroup representation. Remember, I mentioned this is the data set bias. So we should first check for this. And then we can do a mitigation at different levels. So we can do at pre-processing level, in-processing level, and post-processing level. Pre-processing level would refer to how we can generate a fairer data set. So that's the question, and trying to answer that in different ways before we do any sort of machine learning model training or evaluation. In-processing would instead refer to doing mitigation during the model training, so design of the model training and so on. And post-processing would mean once we have trained the model, actually modifying the decision region of the algorithm. So all of these three are supposed to help us get fairer predictions. So now, if we go a little bit deeper into this, so we see there are different methods for pre-processing and in-processing. Again, I won't be covering it all, but for example, ideally, we should have a new data set, and some data sets these days are created in such a way, like fair phase. These days, it's supposed to be a balanced data set from scratch. But most of the data sets we have in affective computing do not fall into this category. So then we can use, for instance, data augmentation as a strategy, or also generative AI these days. We can create synthetic data to help us balance things, or we can do resampling, so down or upsampling. And then in terms of in-processing, there are also different methods. Today, I'll also talk about disentanglement as a methodology. And post-processing, these are mostly, they look like black box sort of tools, and some of the companies provide also these post-processing methods. So now let's look into bias mitigation, analysis and mitigation for facial expression and action unit recognition. So I'll be talking about specifically this RAFDB dataset. And as a disclaimer, I would like to actually say I'm not criticizing the dataset per se, because this dataset was released back in 2017. And as I mentioned, at that stage, there was not much discussion in the effective computing community regarding, data set bias and how we can actually, this might impact some of the things that we are doing and how we can mitigate those. It wasn't really there. And this data set actually was a very good step in terms of providing images from out of the lab environment, so to say, from internet and so on. And the fact that they also provide labels for these sensitive attributes in terms of gender, race, and age really actually does help, or it helped us to get started with this bias analysis research work back in 2019. So this data set has this expression categories: surprise, fear, disgust, happy, sad, anger, and neutral. And then, as I mentioned, as a first step, now following the guide, we should check actually how the data distribution is. And this is what we are looking at in terms of these sensitive groups, how our data distribution is, and we see that it is biased. So for instance, female, there's higher representation of female in terms of samples. Also, white Caucasian is around almost 78% as compared to the other subgroups. And similarly, the age group of 20 to 39, which is the younger population, there also younger adult population is the highest, around 58% of representation. So in terms of fairness measures, we'll be using for simplistic reasons equal opportunity. So what that means is, let's say we have Black, Asian, White, Latino subgroups. Then let's say we have two different methods, machine learning methods, and we want to compare how fair each one of them is. So what we are doing here is we are looking at minimum accuracy obtained for each subgroup. In this case, for method one is the Black subgroup indicated in green. And then we have the maximum accuracy value. In this case, it's for white, which is 0.771. So then fairness in terms of equal opportunity would be just dividing these two, so having a ratio. And that's how we would refer to equal opportunity today. So now let's do these steps. So for the baseline approach, we chose an 18-layer ResNet. At the time, it was widely used for visual recognition tasks. And the idea is to train this as an expression classifier with cross-entropy loss. So I won't go into the details of this, but this is our baseline model. And this is the accuracy we are receiving or getting for each of these attributes. So for now, let's say, even in terms of accuracy, it's not great, it's all right. And there are differences if you look across different subgroups. Interestingly, for example, even though female samples are higher, accuracy for female is lower. So this is what sort of things might happen if we start looking at biased aspects. Then, okay, we can do mitigation at pre-processing level. So one of the easiest is data augmentation. So we can do cropping, rotating, mirroring, even histogram equalization. And then with the augmented data, now we see the same baseline method. So we see there's improvement in accuracy. Also, we see some of the things have changed. For example, now female recognition for female samples is higher, which is more indicative considering they have higher samples. So then let's look at also in-processing level bias mitigation. One of the common techniques is also known as fairness through unawareness. So there could be different methods, of course. I'm just using this one as an example. So here the idea is how we can explicitly dispel the attribute information because it can affect the expression recognition performance. So we have this disentangled approach, also it's called. So it has a primary branch. So we have the facial expression recognition or classification as the primary branch. We also have these parallel branches, and each of them has two parts. So we have the confusion part, so that tries to estimate equal probability for each sensitive attribute to make sure that these sensitive attributes cannot be predicted from the representation. And we also have this classification part. So this learns to predict each sensitive attribute correctly so that the network doesn't end up with a trivial mapping solution. And now if we look at the results, we will see basically that disentanglement does help actually improving accuracy, but also making it more similar across subgroups. So if you look at fairness metric as well, what we are seeing here is, again, the disentangled approach actually with augmentation shows a good potential for mitigating bias, particularly for the unevenly distributed groups. So gender was slightly closer in terms of distribution, but for instance, race and age, it was more unevenly distributed. So there we see the help of disentangled with augmentation much more. So having looked at this pre, in, and post-processing, the question would be, okay, which bias mitigation strategy is the best or better, right? Well, there's no easy answer because each one of them have their pros and cons. So the pre-processing is easier to apply, much straightforward. You don't need a lot of expertise to do it. So that's like the least we could do. For in-processing, for instance, it's the best one in terms of this accuracy fairness trade-off and measure. So it provides this flexibility for determining this trade-off. But it's harder to implement, so you need more machine learning knowledge or technical knowledge. Also, it might incur higher time and computational cost. And post-processing, it's great because it doesn't require access to the raw data, but then it lacks the flexibility that I mentioned for in-processing. So they all have their different pros and cons. But ideally, in some of the examples I gave, we stack them, which means we already used some pre-processing, and on top of it, we did in-processing. So you could do pre, in, and post-processing stack on top of each other to improve further the fairness aspects. So now I'm going to focus on another technique, continual learning. So this was not listed as part of our taxonomy, and I will first try to explain what we mean by continual learning. So in the traditional machine learning, usually the models are trained on big benchmark data sets. That's the typical thing to do. And the idea is by training on large data sets, it should really help us generalize across contexts, so no matter what the context is. But actually, in reality, of course, the context is not always represented in the data set, right? So the training data may be different. And also, if we aim solely for generalization, it comes at the cost of losing or missing out on individual differences. And also, if we want to retrain the models, it will become quite cumbersome. And continual learning is supposed to help with some of these aspects. It was particularly proposed for embodied AI, like robots, because if you think of the robots, and the idea is at some point they really start being part of this world in different ways, be it for delivery or in-home help and care and so on. We can't really put all the data sets and one single model, train the ones on the robot and assume it will be fine. Actually, the learning needs to continue similarly to how humans do. So that's how continual learning is supposed to help. So they're supposed to, as agents, continually acquire knowledge about changing environments. And then the idea is also the data keeps coming, right? So they don't, just like children, they don't get everything at once, but as they sort of experience things, they learn from there. And also, this learning is sensitive towards changing data conditions and is supposed to help with adaptations in the learning to avoid forgetting as well, because it's not just it's supposed to learn, it should also remember what it learned. Okay, so for bias mitigation, it actually can provide robustness against biased attributes by balancing this learning across different domains and leading to fairer models. So this work was already in 2023 published in IEEE Transactions on Effective Computing. And here we're focusing on domain incremental continual learning. And I'll try to explain what we mean by this. So here we have the attribute gender, and the domains are specified as male and female, and the task is classifying the facial expressions. So then the splitting of the domains means we have the male split and the female split, and each split has samples from one domain only. And when we train, the model needs to encounter one split at a time. So for example, first trained on male and then female samples. And then we evaluate on each split after training. So that's how the continual learning is supposed to help. As we see here, the input data distribution changes, but the task to be learned is still the same. It's still classifying facial expressions. Then we also compare it to non-continual learning-based approaches. So I'll quickly just try to cover this without going too much into detail. So the first is baseline. So this is like offline training. All data is used for training the model in one go, like the typical machine learning. And then we have domain discriminative. So here we are trying to actually use this domain class combination. So for example, for gender, female, male, we have two, n is 2, so 2 domains. And if we have 7 classes for the expression, in total, we would try to have this 14 label sort of discriminating model. And then we have the domain independent. So this one has multi-head structure and is utilized in such a way that each head corresponds to one of these domains. The disentangled I already explained, and we are reusing it here as well. And then strategic sampling adds a loss weight for each domain. It's inverse proportional to the frequency of that domain. And then in terms of continual learning based approaches, also there are different approaches that we adopted, but I want to mention we primarily explore these regularization based approaches to make a fair comparison with non-CL approaches because they don't require extra capacity like generative models. So we have like elastic weight consolidation. So this imposes a quadratic penalty on the parameter updates between old and new tasks to avoid forgetting. And then we have the version of this is online. So here we have a single quadratic penalty applied, and it's determined by running some of the Fisher information matrices of the previous task. And then we have synaptic intelligence. So in this one, we are trying to alleviate catastrophic forgetting. Here, the importance of solving a learned task is computed for each individual synapse, and changes in the most important synapses are discouraged. And then we have two more. The memory-aware synapses, this also calculates the importance of each parameter, but this time looking at the sensitivity of the output function instead of the loss. And finally, the naive rehearsal. So here, we're combining new data with the previously seen data while training the model. The fairness measure is the same that I introduced already, the equal opportunity. And then in terms of data sets, you're already familiar with RAFDB. I showed you the first examples via this. And for action unit recognition, we are using BP4D. So this one has 41 subjects. They are performing 8 different tasks, and we have the labels across these 12 AUs from AU1 to AU24. And then again, we have these attributes, male, female in terms of gender, and for race, Black, White, Latino, and Asian. And in terms of distribution, I already showed you for RAFDB how data distribution is biased. And for BP4D, we see actually similar things. The complexity here is, of course, also per AU. There is the distribution differences. So not only across gender, but how much each AU is represented across this gender, but also in terms of these racial subgroups. So it makes it quite complex. In the paper, we explain a lot of the numbers and different aspects, including accuracy related, but here, just for simplicity, I'll be presenting fairness scores, comparing in terms of baseline and then the non-continual learning and continual learning methods. So what we are seeing in general is actually continual learning methods provide better fairness metric. So what we are seeing, particularly for the synaptic intelligence, we see it provides the best fairness results. So even though the data augmentation improves accuracy, it doesn't really impact the fairness scores. This is what we found. And as I mentioned, in continual learning, you can do learning starting from one domain to another. So you could have this ordering effect, meaning do you start first with female group and then male, or do you start first with male group and then you learn female group? Our experiments show that actually different orders of learning the task does not really impact any of the results. And if we look in terms of BP4D, we are also seeing similar results, although, for instance, disentanglement does provide good results in terms of fairness metric. We see again the continual learning approaches providing better results. So particularly if we looked at recognition and like F1 scores are typical way of evaluating action units. We see for disentanglement, this increases when using data augmentation, and it achieves quite a good F1 score. But similar to the RAFDB evaluations, the synaptic intelligence remains the fairest, both with and without data augmentation, because it's prioritizing this balancing learning across the different subgroups instead of trying to maximize individual performance. So key takeaways from this part is that in facial action expression and action unit recognition, preprocessing is a good starting point for mitigating bias, but alone is unable to fully mitigate. So we need to consider in-processing bias mitigation. And we also see that actually continual learning can really help because it's better equipped to deal with biases owing to the learning strategy of focusing one domain group at a time without forgetting the other domain it learned. So it robustly manages imbalances in the distribution, both with and without augmentation. So I'll leave you with further reading suggestions in this area if you're interested. For instance, one is related to uncertainty as a fairness measure, how uncertainty in the data could be used as a measure for fairness. And also a more recent one that will be presented in December in collaboration with Queen's University in Canada, relating to understanding the role of optimizers in group fairness. Okay, so now I'll be touching upon bias in health AI, and this relates to well-being aspects. So well-being is an increasing concern regardless of whether the population is children, young adults, or adults or older people around the world. So we might see the percentages presented differently depending on which resource we look at. For instance, here we are seeing a Good Childhood report says that 5 children in a classroom of 30 in the UK are likely to have a mental health problem. So the main issue is, of course, early detection. So if we can actually do early detection, then particularly for children, this will have impact for the rest of their lives because intervention can then be done early on without major sort of escalation of the issues. But the main problem is there are not enough resources. For instance, in the UK, to get an assessment, an actual assessment, there are waiting times, so it's not that easy because it's resource intensive, and there are not many, human clinicians that can deal with so many cases. So when we started this work on social robotics for child mental well-being assessment, the question was, can we actually use social robots as an alternative means for well-being assessment? And particularly because previously research showed that children, particularly if the robot is their size, they see the robot as a social peer, not necessarily as an authority figure or as a toy, instead as a social peer. And therefore, the social robots could have this potential of, they could engage children in long-term interactions. We can also put them in non-clinical contexts like schools or even community centers, and they can really help providing this initial flagging, helping with this lack of resources. So in the UK, how assessment usually would work is childcare spaces would contact the family, and if the family give consent, the child would be interviewed by a lay interviewer using prototypical questionnaires related to well-being, and this will be recorded. And then these verbal responses will be accessible through the database that's recorded to clinicians. So what we are suggesting is robots could be used in this stage where instead of having a lay interviewer, robots could be used for interviewing, not only verbal responses, but also looking at the non-verbal indicators of speech and behavior, but also could provide initial analysis for initial flagging. So here, where we envisage them to help, and the final diagnosis can still be done by clinicians. And with this in mind, we conducted an initial lab study back in 22, and then we extended it to online studies, also longitudinal, so several sessions. Here I'll be just giving you some short sort of snippet of this research because it was multi-year research. In the lab, children, when they came to interact with the robot, they did various tasks. One of the tasks was related to looking at a picture and providing description of what they see. So these pictures are already used as part of child perception test. And here I'm just going to play a video as an example of what that means.
So for our first picture, what do you think is happening in this picture?
So I think that there is a tiger that is chasing a monkey, and they are in a jungle. Maybe the tiger was just hungry and she wanted to eat the monkey.
Okay, so here you have a sense, of course, this is not a child, this is my postdoctoral researcher, Nicole, at the time. For privacy reasons, we can't really show videos of children, but this was the lab setup, and then there would be different pictures. So here are the 3 examples coming from child perception test. And we did this in collaboration with Department of Psychiatry. So children would provide the descriptions of what they see or how they interpret these pictures to the robot. And then afterwards, the therapist actually looked at the dialogue and their answers and provided an assessment. And then we wanted to see can we use, for instance, visual language models for assessment, and how would they compare to therapist assessment? So we use the prompting. So what we are doing here is we are using the CAT procedure. So this is quite specific. It comes from the manual. And then we provide the child demographic in the prompt, but also the questions and answers between the child and the robot, and the specific CAT section that's being evaluated and the specific item. And in terms of output, it might look a bit complex, but the idea is for multiple choice ones, the VLM either returns the fitting item or states no choice is applicable. And if it's item-based evaluations, the VLM output indicates whether the prompt matches the evaluated CAT item or not. And then what we're seeing is, first of all, for the cases that the human therapist said there was no need for assessment, so children with high well-being, actually the VLM agrees almost 83% of the time with the human therapist. And this is great, because what this means is we can use AI models, already existing LLMs and VLMs, to filter out the group that does not need flagging. So for filtering is great. But if you look at the group that possibly needs assessment, which means they're highly likely to be diagnosed with well-being conditions, we see that VLM actually struggles. So it's only around 14% of the time agrees with the therapist. And that means actually we do need to create more tailored context-specific models for these cases. And if you look at how children's demographics attempt using this affects the results, we see no effect. But interestingly, we see actually VLM incorrectly assesses girls as positive. So there is some bias due to the gender. And because the demographics providing it in the prompt had no effect, we are hypothesizing that this incorrect assessment for girls could be caused because of the way they express themselves, not necessarily because of what they're saying. And then what do we do? So if we see such biases, what do we do in terms of mitigation? So I'm going to link it to adult mental health disorder prediction, because we did mitigation there. So this was done in parallel, actually. And this work also we started back in 22, because when we started looking at it, particularly for behavioral data, there was not much analysis and mitigation. So this was done on existing data sets at the time. So depression, psychos, and DLOG, and they have different data. So two of them have motor activity data, and the DLOG has audiovisual data. And if you look at all the other aspects, so the depression and DLOG are depression labeled, and psychos is schizophrenia labeled. And they have different samples and subjects, but specifically the label of gender is provided. Therefore, we wanted to look at gender bias analysis and mitigation. So what we did was, in terms of methods for bias mitigation, now you're familiar. So pre-processing, we did data augmentation. For in-processing, we did loss reweighting. So this one penalizes misclassified minority classes at a higher weighted proportion. And for post-processing, we use reject option classifier. So this one reclassifies the predictions of the minority group in favor of the minority group, particularly if it falls within a certain decision area. And I'm not going to talk about all the data sets. I'll talk about DLOG specifically. And here you see a lot of numbers. So the bottom part shows the results in terms of fairness metrics and multiple fairness metrics. And we have them divided as in-processing and post-processing, male, female, and so on. What we're seeing in general is that actually, even though in DLOG, female samples are higher, much higher compared to male samples, the model is still biased towards females. And that is interesting. So what we wanted to do was, we wanted to try to mitigate this. So we did this pre-processing, in-processing, post-processing mitigation. So we created more synthetic samples for females. We weighted the algorithm in favor of the females for in-processing. And for post-processing, we reclassified the female samples in favor of the positive class. But none of this helped. So then the question was, okay, what's the potential pitfall here? What's really going on? Because all the hypotheses that we had was not working. And what we found out is that actually, when these vlogs were recorded, female vlogs were longer in duration compared to male vlogs. But the dataset creators decided to use an average length and truncate the videos based on an average length. And that would mean actually exactly what I was referring to as data mismanagement bias, meaning because of the way data has been pre-processed, it causes this unnoticed bias. Because female logs were longer on average, this truncation possibly affects more female logs and causes information loss. So this is one factor. Another one relates to gender differences in the manifestation of depression. So research here is not fully conclusive, but if you look in the literature, we see that there actually female and male tend to show different symptom profiles when depressed. And which one is harder to predict? Is it harder to predict depression in female as compared to male? Again, this is not conclusive. There are different papers regarding this. But in this case, the one that we have in terms of this data set, there might be factors, and this could be also the way they express themselves, just like what was I was showing related to children. Remember, I said there also girls were being biased by the AI model, and not because of what they said, but actually possibly because of the way they were expressing themselves. And this could be similar also here in a completely data set, completely different age group, adults, we're seeing similar sort of results. So what does this mean in practice at that stage is that many bias mitigation techniques at that stage were inadequate to address this problem, this gap in the depression recognition across genders. And interestingly, just last month in February, in the World Economic Forum, there was this panel on women's health. And they were discussing how actually women's health has been a systemic blind spot because it was treated as niche despite affecting half of the population, and they were experiencing delayed diagnosis, limited access, and even underinvestment in terms of women's health, leading to preventable harm. So there they discuss actually how the factors are complex. So it could be due to sex-specific biology, could be also the genetic insights. But in general, our findings very much align with this. Even though this panel did not talk about mental well-being, it was more physical well-being related aspects. Our findings are very much aligned. So this really shows the need for, and that's what they were emphasizing as well, the need for disaggregated research and care. And I would argue that this is the case also for well-being and depression prediction. So from our analysis, what did we recommend, or what can we recommend for bias mitigation and mental health prediction? I'll just pull out some. So for instance, if you're finding that algorithmic bias is present despite balancing samples, and remember we did balance them to try to make up for the different aspects. If it's not enough, then perhaps we need to train a separate model for each demographic group if the samples are adequate. And if mitigation worsens bias, if it does not address the root cause, then what can we do? We might need to employ appropriate mitigation strategies to address the root cause of bias. And for instance, if gender differences in depression diagnosis are observed, then we probably need to work closely with the clinical experts to devise better solutions that can address the gender differences in depression diagnosis. These are some of the recommendations, but the full scale is in the paper as well. And the further reading suggestions for this, because once we understood the complexity, we proposed better solutions for bias mitigation. So for instance, fair refuse, referee-guided fusion for multimodal causal fairness in depression detection, also taking into account causality, and also uncertainty-based multimodal multitask learning for fairer depression detection are two papers that you could look at. So I'll try to sort of round up and finish now with reflections and further open challenges. So as reflection, what I would suggest is, because I'm aware not everybody is a machine learning or AI researcher within the affective computing community, but we use tools, right? A lot of us use various tools. So we need to bear in mind to ask these questions. So are we investigating for whom these models or different techniques or tools that we are using, for whom do they work well and why? Do they work equally well for children, elderly, or is it only for younger adults? Is bias creeping in? So what would that mean for your specific application area? And then, are we doing anything to mitigate these issues, or are we aware of it actually, and are we questioning at least what would this create in terms of implications for our findings that use these tools? There's probably one question to bear in mind. And then I would argue that AAAC, so the Affective Computing Conference, face and gesture, and multimodal interaction communities, these are quite interrelated, and similar researchers go to all of these different conferences. We argued in our AAAC 23 paper that these communities should introduce a required bias analysis section, similarly to how in machine learning conferences there are these ablation studies. Because that way we will bring this awareness as to, no matter what the application context or area is, by doing this required bias analysis, it will just bring more awareness in terms of what's going on. And on top of this, there are, of course, further challenges. So, for instance, ideally, we create various systems, robotic systems, models, and we would like people to use them. We would like people's lives better or improve, sort of do good in the society. And the question is, how fair do our algorithms need to be before they are deemed acceptable? So do we need to keep them for ourselves because we don't feel they're fair enough, or to what extent they need to be fair to become, usable, useful out there? This is a question, and I don't have an answer. And is it worth collecting more data to improve fairness of the algorithm, but at the cost of this individual privacy? So this is another big question that I don't have answer for. And finally, if we sort of lean towards legalistic rules, strict rules about what fairness constitutes or means, do we actually make the bias we are trying to avoid worse? This is an even bigger question that I also don't have answers for, but I'm hoping this will stimulate some discussion. And with this, I would like to thank my team, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hatice. I'm applauding on behalf of everyone. I'm going to stop the recording. I mean, it's amazing how I think we're all kind of aware that we need to build fair systems, but we're not aware of how complex the issue is. So I think your talk has really, provided lots of information and insights and food for thought. So anyway, I'm going to stop the recording and